Okay, just been reminded it's been recorded. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event to discuss the findings, the recommendations, and indeed the implications of the Industrial Strategy Council's last report, which is called Devolution and Governance Structures in the UK, leaving the best till last, we'll see. And obviously, as it is in the title, the report looks at how devolution and governance structures have evolved in the UK, what the lessons that we can draw from this process, and in particular what that means for future approaches to devolution, a particular topic given where we are on levelling up in particular. We've got a great set of speakers and experts to explore these issues in more detail, and I'll introduce them in a second. But as always, before we start, just a few words of housekeeping. As always, the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is CFC Devolution. There will be opportunities to put your questions to the panelists in the sort of second half of this event. You submit your questions at any time. Don't wait until you've heard them all say what they've got to say, and you send it by sending your question via the chat function to ask a question. And when we get to questions, if time allows, we do like you to ask your own questions on occasion. So I might come to you and ask you to ask your own questions, so be ready for that. But if you prefer me to read them, your question, and that's also fine. You just need to let us know when you post your question in the chat function. And we'll be done and dusted by around 4:30. So those are the words of housekeeping. Let me introduce our speakers and panelists. So in a minute, you're going to hear from Andy Haldane, the chair of the Industrial Strategy Council, obviously chief economist at the Bank of England. After Andy said a few words of introduction, Kate Barker, who's also a member of the council, will set out the main findings and the recommendations from the report. After Kate, we'll move on to a panel discussion, and Andy and Kate will be joined by Greg Clark, MP for Tunbridge, Wells, chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee, and obviously former Secretary of State for Business, Energy, and very importantly, Industrial Strategy. Welcome, Greg. Good to see you. You look remarkably recovered from yesterday, so that is a good thing as well. As well as Greg on the panel, we've got Dr. Arianna Giovannini, Associate Professor at the Montfort University, and my colleague Paul Swinney, who's Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. So that's our speakers, that's our panel. So as I said, without further ado, Andy, I'll hand over to you to say a few words of introduction and to set a bit of the context. Andy.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that. And afternoon, everyone. And a particular thank you again to the Centre for Cities for hosting us. As Andrew mentioned, this is the final event. I promise you, this is the final event for the Industrial Strategy Council, which formally ceased to exist a couple of months ago now. I should say I'm particularly delighted to welcome Greg Clark to today's event. Greg, I don't think we can promise you quite as much excitement as yesterday, but I do hope nonetheless there's plenty for us to get our teeth into this afternoon. And Greg, I think more than anyone, was the architect of the 2017 Industrial Strategy, indeed of the Industrial Strategy Council. And I'm personally very grateful to him for all the foresight and for all the support he's offered, both during his time as Secretary of State and indeed afterwards as well. Although the words have changed, the issues led by Greg back then, including the one we're discussing today, remain absolutely central to public policy and absolutely central to the current government strategy in its new form, the Plan for Growth. Place-based policies, or levelling up, as it's now known, was an absolutely central theme of the 2017 strategy and has been a central theme also of the Council's work over the past 2 and a bit years. We've published pretty extensively on the topic, including evidence reviews on UK regional productivity differences, on understanding the policy-making processes behind local growth strategies, across England. And most recently, we've asked the question, what does it take to level up, drawing on a set of detailed international case studies of countries or regions that had successfully done just that. And having spent a lot of time over the past couple of years understanding that levelling up issue, pulling the evidence together, exploring the deep roots of success and indeed failure, exploring the UK historical record and the international experience of others, we wanted this final ISC report to offer some thoughts on how best to go about tackling this most crucial of issues. And today we'll offer those thoughts in the same spirit we've approached all of the Council's work, which is to use research, to use evidence, both domestically and internationally, to put together some, we hope, constructive and objective policy advice to government on levelling up looking ahead. So today's report, which is called Devolution and Governance Structures in the UK, very much follows that formula. And Kate will set out the report's main findings in just a second. Of course, it goes without saying that much has already been said and done on the issue of devolution. I mean, from my perspective personally, I think that this is, among the most important ingredients if we are to make a success of levelling up. In fact, I go further than that and say that I think there's a wholesale rethink and refresh of the UK's devolution model needed, the holy trinity, if you like, of people, powers and monies. That's a necessary condition, if not a sufficient one, for making a success of levelling up, or at least that's my reading of the UK's historical experience and that of most other countries too. Or put differently, I think it's no coincidence that the UK is at the same time both one of the most spatially unequal of the advanced economies, as well as being one of the most centralised. Let me just end by thanking a whole bunch of people on the team who've led our work on levelling up. That includes Robert Zymek, Ben Jones, Anna Romaniuk, Catherine Osborne, Emily Rainsford, Abigail Taylor, Amy Regan, Martin Quinn, Sky Sampson, Tom Stratton, Ben Britton, and anyone else who knows me, plus of course the council members, Kate, Emma Bridgewater, Rotha Johnson and Christine Gaskell, all of whom have overseen our levelling up work. And that's of course not to forget all of those, the many that we partnered with on this work, including many LEPs, many mayoral combined authorities, many of you on this call, and of course the Centre for Cities. And with that, let me stop and pass the floor to Kate. Kate.
Thank you. That's very kind, Andy. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen. This is a bit of a new venture for me. And I'm not quite as ready for it as I might be because I had to close my computer down just now owing to circumstances. But hopefully I will find my way back to what I want. Right, so I would like to take this into slideshow, but just at the second I can't work out how to do it. Okay.
If you go to the bottom, Kate, if you go to the bottom of your screen on the taskbar, there, just keep going to the right. Next one along.
Next one along.
And that one, that's it. Just cancel that. Okay,
thank you.
There we go.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much. I haven't shared my slides before. I've always made other people do the work for me, so this is novel. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming along. And I'm really pleased that we've got this opportunity to present this last report from the Industrial Strategy Council. We worked on this with WM Reddy. Andy's already thanked everybody, and I would repeat the thanks because the team has worked really hard on this. The aim of this report was to contribute to the debate on devolution by identifying the principles which could support and facilitate successful future devolution in the UK, particularly at the sub-regional level. And to do this, the team have been through a whole set of actions. They started off with a literature review, looking at the evidence on the potential benefits from devolution, both in other countries and here in the UK, and on the limitations here to the successful implementation of devolution. We had a look at the history of devolution in the UK. This, of course, as everybody who's involved with devolution at all knows, has been very up and down. We've had a long history of different attempts at various forms of devolution. But despite this, the UK remains an unequal country, both within and between regions. So the question is it that the devolution hasn't helped, or is it that devolution somehow hasn't taken the right form, or we haven't stuck with it for long enough? The team also took a range of primary evidence from stakeholders who engage with or work in sub-national governance across the UK, trying to understand from their point of view what works and what needs to change. It's clear that this isn't all about governance. So what does that mean? It means that a survey was conducted by the team, a series of focus groups and interviews was run, engaging with over 50 local stakeholders. The survey aimed to collect data from LEPs and mayoral combined authorities to gain information and insights into devolution and governance structures. We then used the focus groups to gain a deeper understanding of the specifics on what's been working well and what could be working better, and then looked at 6 case studies: Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, the West Midlands, Leicester and Leicestershire, Glasgow and Liverpool. That's a pretty varied mix of areas, and it was chosen because they were varied not just in terms of their economies, but also in terms of their present governance structures and the level of devolution. Quite a lot of the case study work was done with desk research, but it was supplemented with interviews with academics, businesses, and people working with the councils in those areas. And this evidence enabled us to develop a lot of understanding of the current government landscape. The report mentions this, but I think a potential criticism of the work is that there may have been a touch of selection bias in the people we spoke to, because many of them were people who would tend to be rather committed to furthering devolution. Given this array of evidence, the team needed to find a way to synthesize it, to draw it together in order to arrive at some sensible lessons. And we decided to build on the OECD model for decentralisation, but adding a 4th pillar, which is called people and place. And this 4 pillars model that the council has produced, we feel covers all the vital aspects of devolution and uses the evidence from the primary research and then develops recommendations. How did we interpret the 4 pillars? Well, political, you need elected leadership positions, and to ensure that local democracy is a strong element of devolution. Administrative, the capacity to do policy development and policy implementation, accountability, transparency of what you're doing, and good structures. Fiscal decision-making, particularly on spending, and possibly on the future also on more local taxation. And finally, people in place, that means collaboration from the public sector across businesses and other players in an area, building partnerships in order to develop legitimacy, getting to the right scale, and of course, identity. It was interesting to notice in the quotations in the report from individuals who talked to the team, how many of them talked about the need for people to have some resonance for the place you're talking about, to have some resonance. I think if we think back to the experience of the RDAs, some of the RDAs, perhaps in particular, the Southeast RDA, which is very large, people didn't really have resonance with, they didn't necessarily feel that they lived in the Southeast RDA. All this research and evidence was then translated into a devolution framework. What we were trying to do here was develop a structure and set of principles that would survive changes of government to ensure that this process doesn't have to be repeated. That's probably a bit optimistic. I think the optimism of economists generally in looking for things that will survive changes of government has not in the past been particularly successful. However, it must be worth trying again, because actually longevity of policy is the one thing that people feel really holds places back. The framework we've proposed has two parts: policy principles and guiding principles. The policy principles are the tangible and actionable recommendations. We think that good devolution will meet all the criteria that have been set out under the pillars in this framework. The guiding principles are more about behaviour, the behaviours that people who work with or in the subnational government structures should adopt. And so the recommendations we're looking at under the 4 pillars are under the political pillar. We'd like to see the number of elected leadership positions increased and the transfer of powers down to sub-regions across a wide range of policy areas, not of course whole policy areas, but certainly subsets of policy. And then ensuring that we have the right checks and balances, particularly over finances and the reporting of outcomes. And ensuring actually that we don't do what's happened in the past, where local authorities or other subnational groups are asked to deliver things without being given the ability to do it, without being given the financial heft that they need to deliver the objectives. Administratively, you want structures and institutions with clear jurisdictions, but also with their own agenda in order to eliminate duplication. And inbuilt review mechanisms to ensure that we transfer power on the basis of transferring it to bodies who can deliver these outcomes. In terms of fiscal, long-term certainty of funding for the agreed responsibilities. I already referred to this in a way as the sort of, for economists, a bit of an aim. We're always hoping for the holy grail of long-term certainty. In this case, we've suggested an updated and improved Barnett-style formula as a basis for fiscal devolution, with additional funding available through competitive bidding, although at least I personally hope there'll be rather less competitive bidding. I think the tendency for central government to perpetually put out competitive bids tends to skew local authorities' activities too much, because they feel obliged to bid for things, even if perhaps it wouldn't be their number one goal. And over time, we want to have less prescriptive devolving of funding, less ring-fenced funding, and the possibility of local tax raising powers. Looking at people in place, the important thing here is transparency. We want the public to be well informed about how these new systems and places operate. Where necessary, might redefine boundaries to align to policy areas and also to ensure that they go along with economic functionality. On the whole, we were thinking that we wanted to try and avoid redrawing too many boundaries. That, again, we're trying to build on what's there already rather than impose a whole new system. But it may very well be necessary to remove some of the overlaps in boundaries that exist in the present system, which actually are not necessarily very helpful. And I think also that this will help us to achieve the aim of responding to local identities. So how's this all going to work? Well, I think our research has suggested that previous findings are appropriate in saying there's no one optimal scale at which we should be implementing devolution in the UK. When we've looked at successful examples of subnational governments, they've cut across the scales. They haven't necessarily been the same institutional setup. It's not necessarily one size fits all model. So we've proposed that we stay with the sort of multi-scalar model we have. We think that satisfies the needs for both place-led solutions and good governance. It's an iterative approach. It suggests that the devolution that we're looking for in the UK is a process. It's not an event. As I say, we're building on the structures already there rather than proposing a whole new system. We want to strengthen the structures that are already in place, particularly by using the flexibility of resources, moving resources between the tiers as appropriate. And having this flexibility ensures that the institutions you're delegating to are sufficiently agile. They've got the capacity, we hope, to absorb new or additional responsibility relatively quickly, and that may mean there's a bit of slack in administrative resources at the beginning. But we have to make sure that we balance this delegation with safeguards. You'll see in the report that we've talked about examples of the criteria for an area to be delegated to. And one way in which we suggested the process is set out on this chart, where central government starts off by delegating to areas which in the long term it thinks are too big. The most obvious way to do this would be to start off with greater devolution to the devolved administrations and also to the existing regions. Plus, I've already said, some of those regions really don't have the criteria of economic functionality and identity that you would want for effective devolution longer term. The larger areas, however, would be able to have some oversight of their whole region, initially holding the budget and responsibility, while the next stages in the devolution process are identified. And it's the prize of greater devolution that we think would incentivize the players below those big regions to establish the necessary and appropriate governance structures so that they can then demand that they would be devolved too. So you can see that we're looking for devolution based on evidence as we move down that lower areas are able to meet the criteria that have been set out. If they are unable to meet the criteria, of course, they will remain under the remit and responsibility of the devolved administration and indeed the English regions. There's a bit of a risk in this. I mean, given all this, given more power to devolved administration in English regions, of course, they might well want to hang on to it, and it will be up to central government to ensure that they are in fact able to move on to the devolution. The aim of this, of course, is to have a kind of settled state. One of the complaints in the interviews was that often devolution seems to be starting again. Someone said, every 10 years, instead of actually doing anything in our area, we're all consumed with thinking about how to reorganize ourselves. The importance of this approach is that it would develop over time, it would become settled. I think this is a really valuable contribution to the debate. I think it opens up the opportunity of a really fruitful way forward. And I hope that the people who are working on levelling up in a places sense, which is the way in which we've interpreted in this document, really read this and think about how to respond to it. Thank you for your attention. I'll now attempt to stop screen sharing and hand back to the panel.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Kate. In a short time, really provided a kind of richness of what you were investigating, what you were looking at, but also some of the issues and lots, I think, to explore. What I'll do now is ask our panel members for their initial reflections and reactions on what they've heard or what's in the report, and then we broaden it out. So, Greg, if I can turn to you first, it'd be great to get your initial reflections on what you've heard, what's in the report, and then I think as we move through, we'll probably broaden it out to broader questions about the future of devolution, the role of an industrial strategy within the government's overall approach. But your initial reactions, and then I'll go to Arianna and then Paul. So, Greg.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for hosting this. It's good to be back in the same discussion with you. It's been a little while. And
is that a good thing or a bad thing that it's a déjà vu?
In a very good positive way. Not all déjà vus are, but this one is, and Paul and many other panelists. And first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Andy and Kate and everyone on the Industrial Strategy Council. Kate was talking, I suspect knowingly, about building things that endure across different administrations. And I confess that the Industrial Strategy Council was an attempt to do precisely such a thing, to establish a group of people of not just eminence, but of capability that would command, and they certainly do command, I think, the respect of the country. And so it's a matter of great disappointment to me that I think it's a misstep to fail to take advantage of the wisdom and the insight that comprise the people, but also the institution. But I'm grateful for the brilliant work, analytically rich and powerful in terms of its policy prescriptions. In its too short life, Andy and the whole council have done a fantastic job, and I'm very grateful for the work that they've put into that. I take some reassurance from the fact that even though the words industrial strategy seem to have been retired from use by the government, I think a lot of the underlying content is not only extant, but actually in many cases has been reinforced. I chair, as you said in your introduction, Andrew, the Science and Technology Committee. I considered it to be quite an achievement when I increased from 9 billion a year to 12 billion a year the science budget through the industrial strategy. But the new administration is increasing it from 12 billion a year to 22 billion a year, far outstripping anything that I was able to contribute. And I think I hope the same is true when it comes to place. It was quite a battle to get government to take place seriously from 2010, when my party came into government. And your think tank, Andrew, was always a big ally in the fight to inject a sense of place into government policy. At first, it was pretty much just DCLG that was seen to be the place that knows place, if I can put it that way. And the Treasury and the Business Department, these were all explicitly pursuing a kind of national policy agenda that in some cases, in the case literally of the Treasury, the concept of local growth was considered to be strictly impossible. When we had a discussion about a city deal for Cambridge, I remember being advised by officials that the trouble is that if Cambridge grows faster, if we do things, invest in the infrastructure to attract more businesses and create more jobs, if Cambridge grows faster, then everywhere else in the country has to grow slower. This bizarre paradox, why should this be the case? Because growth is projected nationally. And so to accommodate it in the Treasury view of the time, it was literally the case that you had to revise down the growth assumptions of other places. Totally nuts, because just as the Treasury and the Business Department is seized of the view that a country can be either well set to attract and encourage growth or to impede it, so it's true for place. And everyone on this call, I'm sure, understands that and have done from the cradle, but it was too little prominent in government. And so I think the fact that we're now having this discussion today, the fact that levelling up is so prominent a term, levelling up in my view comes from Andy, from when he describes the long tail of underperformance in productivity terms. He described it, but he's also applied it, and it applies completely to other aspects of prosperity and indeed in non-financial aspects such as educational attainment. And the insights that Andy has consistently pursued, that if only you can drive up from the long tail of relative underperformers, higher up the curve, more towards the median and perhaps beyond, then you can transform not just the prospects of people in those places, but you can transform national prosperity too. And that insight seems to have been carried forward very strongly with this agenda. So I think it's a positive thing, and the fact that this discussion and this paper is about addressing the question of, in many ways, how to devolve rather than whether to devolve, is a sign of great progress that I think should not be unremarked, and it was progress that was fought for. In terms of the suggestions that are made, I think it's a very good and strong contribution to the debate. I just want to very briefly, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, I know, I want to perhaps kind of strike a note of a friendly disagreement with this. I always thought, when I was the minister responsible for this in various capacities, that there was as it were, a constitutional approach to devolution, and there was, call it bespoke, call it pragmatic, but a non-constitutional approach. And what I mean by this is, do you codify a new set of relationships that become part of the wiring of the state between central government, perhaps regional government, local government at different levels, and define very closely their powers and have a consistency across the country of that. That is clearly an option that's available. And I think for the nations, for Scotland, for Wales, and to Northern Ireland, that I think for understandable reasons has been the approach that's been taken. But for reasons, touching on what Kate said about identity, I'm not convinced that that works as uniformly as it would be required for it to be accepted as a blueprint for all parts of the United Kingdom and for England in particular. Because the truth is that there is, I think, a varying appetite, and from that sometimes capability for doing things differently. And one of the reasons that we pursued a policy, I instigated a policy of city deals that then became growth deals as places that weren't cities were keen to do this, was that it didn't need to be the same everywhere. So if you negotiated a deal with one place, there wasn't an automatic assumption that that had established a constitutional settlement. So that's one reason that I think there is too much, or there is, I shouldn't say too much, there is in many ways, I think, a welcome sense of diversity in the country. The other reason why I'm hesitant about having a constitutional approach to devolution, and why I prefer the deal approach, not just because I invented it and there's always a tendency to prefer that, but there was a reason behind it, and I think that it captures a sense of joint interest in particular places. So, for example, if we're to take the West Midlands, for example, the prosperity of the West Midlands is clearly of great interest to local people in the West Midlands and people in Birmingham, in Wolverhampton, in Coventry, and its different component parts. That's very clear. There's a strong local interest, but there's also a strong national interest in the West Midlands being prosperous. The Treasury has a big interest in the West Midlands being prosperous. And so to devolve all of, or a great part of the responsibility for that prosperity to the West Midlands, I think then leaves unrepresented the national interest in this. And the national interest can come with views and suggestions and policy interests. So that's true for the Treasury, for economic policies, for example. It's also true if we think of healthcare. Of course, any place, take Greater Manchester, has a strong local interest in a high-performing healthcare system that benefits the citizens. But we do have, and there's great pride in us having a national health service. And I don't think it would be right to devolve in the sense of to kind of carve out for total local discretion the health service in Greater Manchester. It still should be part of, and I think people in Manchester wanted to be part of, the NHS, the National Health Service. And so finally, I'll end on this. I think the sense of a deal, it was not invented as a kind of convenient political slogan. It was designed to point to something in its contents, that this was two parties, local and national, coming together and working out what are the things that are in their shared interest and agreeing on that, signing a deal, making a contract, and it can be shorter or longer, being willing to stick to that so that people can have confidence, but not expecting that to be unilaterally devolving from Whitehall, from the nation to local discretion, but trying to come together with that, and that might differ from place to place. There are a couple of reasons why I think, whilst there's no one more passionate than I am about the progress to decentralize the country that has been far too centralized, as Andy said, for far too long. But there are different routes to it, and I would prefer something a bit less formal and, as I term it, constitutional.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Greg. As always, very considered and thoughtful reflections. Let me just declare my bias as the chair, so everybody knows where we're going to go on some of the. I'm with Greg on I favour the deal-based approach. Always have done, and accept, that there are asymmetries and messiness and all the rest of it that comes from that. But I still think that approach outweighs. However, it does raise interesting questions about the comprehensiveness and the coverage, which I think we'll come back to when we get into some reflections from the panel. But let's move to Arianna. Arianna, let's hear from you, your reflections on what you've heard so far, the content of the report, and then again, we'll open it out. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks very much also to the Industrial Council team for this exceptional piece of work. I think it's very, very valuable, especially at this point in time when it's really important to press on with the devolution agenda. The paper highlights in a very effective ways the issues that underpin the approach to devolution in our country. And we know that the UK is the most regionally unequal and centralized country in the industrialized world. And this is not a coincidence. I think this is a very important point that the report really brings out very, very clearly. The two things are tightly connected. There have been, over the past years, there have been a number of reports and research that has demonstrated this. If you have a strong, very centralized system, as we have in the UK and in particular in England, that will have an effect on the extent of our regional inequalities. So without addressing over-centralization in a coherent way and with a long-term and consistent strategy, regional inequalities will continue to grow. So in essence, without a coherent devolution strategy, there will be no leveling up. And that's a very, very important point that we really need to emphasize, and the report supports with a lot of evidence. And this is a persisting issue that we've seen in our political system. Rebalancing the economy has been the priority of many governments of many different colors for a very long time. And the issue is still standing because, as the report highlights very well, there have been ebbs and flows in decentralization policy. And if I can be a little bit critical, I think that too often, not just this government, but also if we look at the past decades, political interests have tended to prevail. And the result has been that the approach to devolution has been piecemeal. There have been some moments of strong push and then coming back to moments where the devolution agenda has been stalling. So in this way, the goalposts, the approaches, the scales, the powers on offer are continuously shifting. And this is creating a problem because as a result of this, it's not a surprise that our system of subnational governance, in particular in England, is becoming not only more complex, but also more difficult to govern, less governable and less effective in many respects. So I think that the work undertaken as part of this report and its findings are very much needed and very much on point. And the proposed devolution framework really, what is really valuable in that is that it really provides an essential tool for policymakers at all levels of government that really provides a kind of a roadmap to take the devolution agenda forward that can survive changes of national government and generate really a roadmap that is coherent and sustainable in the long term, not just in the short term. I think that both the policy and guiding principles that are outlined in the report and that Kate presented earlier on are very well thought through and welcome, especially because they present and frame devolution for what it is. As Kate said before, it is a process and not an event. And so it requires clarity of purpose as well as flexibility in its implementation. And this is something that probably the approach that we've seen so far has been effective to some extent, but the element of flexibility maybe needs to be emphasized forward, as well as having an idea of what is the kind of end point of the process. And so that's something that the report really emphasized very well. Similarly to Greg, I will close with a couple of points of not criticism, but maybe something that we can open up for discussion. The multi-scalar approach that is part of the recommendation and is suggested as part of the report is a very interesting one. And personally, it makes a lot of sense to me, especially if we look at what is happening in other countries. However, if we compare that model to what has been happening in recent years, especially in England, where the report suggested it should be like an approach based on the administrative regions, I think that is a bit problematic, because in recent years we've seen that the scale of regions in that sense has not had as much purchase as it had in the past, and perhaps city regions have been seen more as the kind of more suitable scale for devolution. I'm not saying that this is without criticism. If we look at other countries, there is a scale, precisely that type of multi-scalar model works really well. Germany is the prime example of that. I'm just wondering, how do you guarantee that, in a sense, how do you ensure that there is some degree of government buying into regions as recipients of devolution, considering that that scale has been kind of put aside for a while now? There is also the other problem with this type of multi-scalar approach, if we want to be a little bit critical, is that it assumes, or maybe presumes, collaboration between and across all tiers of government. And this is not always the case. We know that this is a problematic point, in the sense that if we look at the devolved nations in the UK, we know that there are tensions between the devolved governments and what happens at the local level. So how do you ensure that that relationship becomes more positive and collaborative? And similarly in England, perhaps a bit as a result of the deal approach, devolution goes together with a sense also of competition. You have to put in bids to central government. You have to, different areas have to demonstrate that they've got what it takes to deserve, in a sense, devolution. And that is good in one sense, but in the other, if we look especially at the most disadvantaged areas, maybe the areas outside the big cities, this has meant that some areas have been kind of left behind, and this has promoted a bit of a sense of competition in a negative way. So again, how do you foster collaboration following the multi-scalar approach, considering that at the moment, rather than cooperation, the model is based on a principle of competition? Again, I'm not saying this because I don't think the model wouldn't work, but probably these are some of the things that need to be thought through, because I think that the multi-scalar approach model is a very good idea. And so the second point and final point that I want to make in terms of things to reflect on is connected to this, because the report argues that there is a need to allow for a process of devolution that combines top-down and bottom-up approaches. And again, I fully agree with this, but to achieve this, in my view, it is also essential to involve the subnational level into discussions. So if you want a process that has a mix of bottom-up and top-down approaches, you have to find a form to or a framework for devolution that is not just decided unilaterally by central government, but maybe in collaboration and cooperation, again, using the kind of shift of spirit, if you like, with local leaders. Metro mayors are now established figures. Why not involving them more directly into thinking about what devolution should look like going forward? But not just metro mayors, also council leaders, so that there is a sense also at the subnational level that devolution is not just done on places, but is done with places as well. And so I think I'll close here, and thanks very much again for the report. I just wanted to put out this kind of a couple of points to broaden out the discussion, but I think that the recommendations are very good, and this is an outstanding piece of work, not least for the great amount of empirical work that underpins the findings. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Another great set of contributions. We'll certainly come back. So going to get Kate and maybe Andy's thoughts on this question about, you mentioned regions. There's been several questions. So we'll come back to that and get your thinking a little bit more on that and where that takes us. But let's hear from our final panel member, Paul. Paul, my colleague from the Centre for Cities, your reflections on the report, Paul?
Great. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for what they've said so far. And indeed, thanks to the council for putting this together. I think there's a lot that we would very much agree with that's in the report, and very much chimes with the work that we did last August, looking at exactly this issue around reorganisation, financial flexibilities, powers that are passed down, etc., etc. So loads to agree with. It's also, I think, well, it was great to see the history bit in there for policy wonks who want to go and have a look at that. The only bit that was missing was a bit that Alfred the Great played in all of this. For those who are really interested in this area, definitely would recommend going back to understand that as well. But I think what I think was particularly pleasing about what is in the report, and indeed is framed by the discussion today, is the idea that we do need to have some degree of local government reorganisation. And that is really controversial. So it's fantastic actually that we're talking about that today. And let me just set out why that's important, because I think we haven't really spoken perhaps so much about that. We've talked about the methods of doing it, but it is worth just taking a step back, because if we understand why it's important, then I think the logic about why we should go about doing that is perhaps flows through. Whereas if you just hear local government reorganisation, you go, oh, I don't fancy that. That sounds like it's quite difficult. So in the UK, as others have said already, one of the most centralised countries in the Western world, but local government has got some power within that. We're talking about devolution today, but it has got some power. We mustn't forget that. The problem is that the limited power that local government does actually have within this very centralised system is sliced and diced in loads of different ways. So local government as a unit has powers, but some of that is at a county unitary level, some of that's at a district level, and then some of that's at a county level. And the arbitrary nature of sort of how they're distributed across, sort of either horizontally across the city or up and down between districts and counties, there's no rhyme or reason as to why economic powers sit in the way that they do. Normally what that means is that it takes those very limited powers and dilutes them even more. And that's really bad for local government in terms of its ability to do things. Now, let me give you an example of how that plays out. And I'll pick probably perhaps the most extreme one, but I think it is the most illustrative one. If we look at Nottingham, the built-up area of Nottingham. So I'm just talking about Nottingham Local Authority, because by the way, all the sports grounds in Nottingham don't sit in Nottingham Local Authority, even though they're very much institutions of the city. You look at the built-up area. So you fly over in a plane and you look down and say, where is Nottingham? Get your sort of massive felt tip pen out and draw around. The area that you're likely to draw around to capture that built-up area will go through 9 different local authorities. 9 for one city. You've got your unitary, which is the central one, Nottingham. You've got 6 districts, and you've got 2 counties as well. Now, let's say we are going to build some new housing in Gedling, which is just the south of Nottingham, and I think that is the authority that has Tunbridge and the football grounds in it as well. Let's say we're going to build some houses there, and those people are going to work in Nottingham city centre. Now, that requires jobs to be created in Nottingham city centre, which is the responsibility of the city. It requires houses to be built in the district of Gedling, and it requires transport connections in between, of which some of that's the responsibility of the district and some of that's the responsibility of the county. Now, in an ideal world, everyone will play nicely and come together and put together a strategy and deliver that strategy in the way that we want it. I think the reality is that that just isn't going to happen in the 99% of cases. And that's really difficult, again, in terms of trying to have coherent joined up economic policy at the local level. And so that's 9 different leaders, that's a number of different economic development departments, a number of different planning departments who aren't necessarily talking to one another. And it's for this reason why local government reorganisation has to be the first thing we talk about when we talk about devolution. So we always want to talk about, well, what powers are you going to pass down? Hang on, let's get the institutions right first. If you haven't got the institutions right, then passing down those powers is going to be much more difficult. And indeed, we do hear over the years a lot, and I'm sure Greg has heard this as well within the corridors of Whitehall, of civil servants and perhaps even politicians as well, pushing back over the years, saying, well, we couldn't possibly devolve because there isn't the capacity at local level. I mean, we can have a debate about whether that's true or not, but certainly in terms of how we fragment local government, there's something in that argument that we need to change. So that's why. Now, would we go about doing the multi-scale away? So we're getting very much at the splitting hairs here, and we've had, I think, a couple of different reflections already. Greg is very much on the one end, multi-scale is in the middle. Actually, I'd go at the other end and say, I think we need to have coverage of all of this. I think we need to act in a way that brings about a change and clarity fairly quickly, rather than perhaps compounding the patchwork quilt that we've already got within England, and indeed in Scotland and Wales too. We'd like to see similar changes there as well, and Northern Ireland. And actually the government needs to set out what its criteria are for enlarging local authorities, and then sort of push that through. Because if we are in a position where we leave it to local actors, the problem is that some will sort of be responding in a certain way, responding to a certain type of a criterion incentive, and some will try to respond in a different way. I think it's only really national government that has that oversight about what is it that we're trying to achieve. Here are some criteria about how we do it, and there's got to be some sort of control and coordination around how that is done. So actually, I think we would go more prescriptive on this case, and we've got a number of criteria about how we would do that. Our suggestions take us from 348 authorities in England down to 69, which again is very, very controversial, but we feel that's quite a direct way of doing things. I think my concern around the multi-scalar approach is perhaps it's a pragmatic approach to get around some of the political issues, but it may sort of drag things out, and we might end up with a patchwork that is not dissimilar to the patchwork we have already. But I think crucially here, the differences are tiny. We all agree on the big thing that needs to happen, but it shows, I think, the politics and the practicalities of doing it. Actually, there's still a lot to be thought through, and that is quite difficult before you even get to the policy powers, which hopefully we'll have a conversation about as well. But that's the case I want to lay out, Andrew, so I'll pass back to you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Paul. So lots in there already. Let's take some of these issues in turn. Kate, if I can come to you first. The report talks about regions, which, for many of us who may remember, and Greg may remember this, talking of regions was banned, certainly in the coalition government. You weren't allowed to talk about regions or regional development agencies, but you picked this up in the report and offer that as a sort of staging post, I think. Can you just say a little bit more about that and what that actually, what your thinking is associated with that?
Well, I will answer that question. I'll probably pick up on a couple of the comments that Greg and Paul have made from very different angles, actually, I must say. I think it's rather nice. I often find myself in the middle of a debate being semi-radical. I think the reason for going to regions is that there was an anxiety, not certainly early on, to reinvent structures that weren't already there. And the regions, although do still exist in some slightly leftover capacity. The difficulty with this, and I'm a bit surprised nobody commented on this, is that of course the regions in a sense are now occupied across various areas that have different things. I mean, the Northwest region clearly has within it already two very distinct cities pursuing different policies. So you would already have a need for collaboration. So I think my view is that I wouldn't hope for the powers I would expect the powers not to sit at the regional level for very long. I hope some of that came across. I want to respond really to a couple of points that Greg made. I mean, I think there's an inevitable tension, isn't there, between what national government thinks it wants and what local areas want, and no neat way of organising us is going to play that out. But if you sort of think about health, for example, you would naturally think, as we do have, of the National Health Service as setting down some basic standards. But beyond that, we all know that the district or county or whatever regional health authorities do things a little bit differently. And they do it because they think they're responding to local wishes and conditions. And then people pop up and say, well, health's just a postcode lottery. And that, for me, illustrates the tensions you always have between having a firm national standard, which then doesn't really fit places, but then people feeling unhappy if they feel they're doing a bit less well on something than something else. And you have to be a persuasion that actually allowing a bit more local freedom is beneficial, and trying to overcome the postcode lottery point. And just on the city deals, as you may remember, Greg, I led some work in Cambridge and Peterborough, so I looked at the deal that was given to the Metro Mayor there. And it was, in many ways, it was a good deal, and it did really spark off some activity, not sufficiently collaborative at the beginning, but becoming, I think, more collaborative over time, which was very good. But there was a great thing that central government left Cambridge and Peterborough with, which is this target of doubling GVA by a certain date. without actually defining what the central government meant by that. So on some definitions, it would have been enormously easy. On other definitions, it would have been almost impossibly difficult. And we did waste a bit of time wondering. And eventually, of course, we came up with something in the middle, as I always do, which was achievable, but not, not overbearing. So, and it's not really clear to me that left to itself, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough would quite have gone for that. I think they might have had other things that they thought were more important. So I do worry about how far, if we are serious about devolution, we want national government to continue to be the standard setter. So I thought in a way your talk combined with Paul's rather neatly set out Paul's quite radical approach, combined with the sort of still cautious Westminster approach, frankly, Greg, even for somebody like you, who I know is pretty keen on devolution. Anyway, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Claire. I'll get Greg to come in a second to pick up this, these kind of questions about comprehensiveness and coverage and how you might achieve that, and particularly Arianna's point, which is, I think it's fair, Greg, a point around the deal-based approach is good for those that want to play. For those places that don't want to play, does that matter? Do we just kind of leave them out of the agenda? Or, I mean, you think about the kind of ongoing conversations that we were all involved in Yorkshire, in the sense of, Leeds and the greater Leeds area and the greater Sheffield area, they're important for the national economy, but, they found it difficult sometimes to come together. How do we reconcile what the nation needs or what the country needs, as well as what localities need as well? So I'm going to come to you in a second, but Andy, I just wanted to get your reflections on, the point you made, I think almost right at the beginning, which is about, devolution being critical to a good industrial strategy, or achieving the objectives of the industrial strategy, and therefore what that means about whether we do give that sufficient importance, and whether that view is more widely held, or whether there is still a view that actually we can do good industrial strategy without significant devolution. I just don't know. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, Andy.
Thank you, Andrew. Fascinating discussion across the panel. I mean, terrific that people have got slightly different flavors of how this might be done, while everyone, agreeing on the right direction of travel. There absolutely is a huge amount that can and probably should be done at the national level to put in place an industrial strategy to drive forward productivity and the like. And there was a lot in the 2017 strategy that was national in scope, and rightly national in scope, and absolutely essential, I would say, to make good on some of the elements of boosting productivity and pay. I would say, though, when it comes to issues of place, I mean, one striking feature of the map of the UK is just how incredibly localized performance is. I mean, a given city, as Andrew, very well, can contain within it an incredible patchwork quilt of performance. And if we are to speak to those often very localized problems, that will of necessity require some very localized solutions. I think doing that at the national level is almost impossible to tailor in that way. Indeed, some of the best examples I've seen of the joining up of policy has been at the localized level. I mean, it's very tricky to formulate an integrated strategy plan that pieces together health and transport and business and HE and FE. And the best examples I've seen of that joining up of the different arms of policy have often been at the local level. So I do think this is, as was there in the 2017 strategy, an essential pillar of meeting our productivity challenges, a necessary condition in the language I used earlier on, but not a sufficient one, and very much complementary to the national plans we'll need for infrastructure, for skills, and for innovation as well. I'll stop there, Andrew. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Greg, just elaborate a bit more on how you sort of reconcile the kind of, well, is there a reconciliation between the deal-based and the desire for coverage? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And if I may, if you still were the Secretary of State, which would be marvelous, in a sense, what would you be looking for in terms of that next phase or a phase or further phase of devolution? And I guess these again are not either ors, but it's the coverage versus the deepening, in the sense that places that have got some inevitably and understandably want more, while many places don't have anything and they want something.
Yeah.
So just put yourself in your, as if you were still there. You may want, you might have done that. I'm sure you have. You're a kind of very reflective man. But just unpack this comprehensiveness versus deal-based approach first off, and then what you would want for further devolution.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I think one of the things that I would do if I had the chance is actually to take up some of Paul's suggestions on the reform of local government, because we are building it around existing institutions. And I can say this from the backbenchers, that would be very controversial if I said this from the dispatch box, but I think we have too many councillors. And you might think that is paradoxical for someone who is as committed a localist as I am to say that. But I think that we would benefit from having greater prominence and profile of people's local elected members. It's notable that in the devolution deals that have been done, the biggest powers devolved have gone where there's a mayor, there's a single individual, because there's an implicit judgment in that, and it was obviously one that I was part of making, was that actually that's a more coherent, dependable, or certainly accountable way of exercising power than if you have a large number of people. I mean, I'm struck, in my county of Kent, for example, I think we've got over 500 councillors at county and across the 12 districts, 500 people, good, well-motivated people, but 500 people running Kent when we have probably about, I don't know how many English MPs we have, probably about 500 out of the 650 across the United Kingdom. I think that is out of kilter. So I have always been a believer in unitary authorities and with fewer councillors, but not to diminish their strength, but actually to increase them. I'm struck, I think Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, which is a big Britain's biggest authority, I think Europe's biggest authority, has 101 councillors last time I checked. The city of San Francisco is run by 11 councilmen. And I suspect that the way that you can run a city, if you have 11 directly elected people, may in some ways be more kind of functional than if you have 101. Now, they may be polls, and there may be something in between, but I think you get the point. It's also the case that last time I checked, that to be call them supervisors actually in San Francisco, but to be a supervisor, to be one of the 11, you get paid $140,000 a year, and district councillors don't get that. It might be that you could save money or do it for the same money and actually allow people to come in who could commit more time to it. So I think there's an important area of reform there. But when it comes to the kind of patchwork aspects, so the first thing, I mean, it's something that Arianna said, that political interests can prevail. Political interests must prevail. You can't do this, and I think it's for all of us involved in this. This can't be a designed by technocrats, and with due respect for everyone on the call, I include myself in this in many respects. We can't sort of work up a blueprint and then say in a democratic country, we think this is the rational process. This is what we want to have. This is what kind of happened before 2010 when we had the regional referenda. And I was born and bred in Middlesbrough, as some of you know. And I remember that at the time, there was huge resentment on Teesside of the paraphernalia and the institutions of the Northeast. It's one of the reasons, and perhaps a historical footnote that probably most people on this call know, that it was where Dominic Cummings found his taste for campaigning by leading the Northeast Says No campaign. And the Northeast was chosen because it was assumed to be the place that would be most enthusiastic for this. And it gave such an emphatic no. And I remember, but it didn't leave the bloodstream, this administrative desire for neatness. When I came into government and we had to abolish the RDAs, it was in our manifesto that we should do that. The Northeastern RDA was abolished and we were creating these local enterprise partnerships. And there was a big push that there should be a Northeast local enterprise partnership, comprising the whole of the region from Berwick down to Teesside and boundaries of North Yorkshire. And the Northeast Chamber of Commerce made a strong argument that to break up these, the strength of the region would be substantially to diminish it. Again, there was outrage on Teesside, and they came to see me in my ministerial office and said, "You're not going to let this happen as a Teessider, are you? We want a LEP. We want a Teesside LEP, and this isn't a matter of discretion for you. We're not going to cooperate unless we have our own." And actually, the industries on Teesside and the communities on Teesside are very different from those on Tyneside. And we created the LEP in Teesside from the beginning because it had such local enthusiasm, did very well. It was way ahead of the others. Actually, the Tyneside one took much longer to get together, and it created the mayoralty of the Tees Valley, and the mayor there is doing a very good job. So you have to let politics in, and it will be, and politics is messy because it reflects people's local strengths. When it comes to the kind of, as it were, the people left behind from this, I don't think I think there should be a standing invitation. I don't think it should be around competition. That there are winners and losers, and that you require that there should be losers and the winners take it all or take the spoils. I think what you should have in negotiating a deal is high standards, exacting standards, and anyone that meets those standards in terms of what they propose, how they propose to do things differently, you should say enthusiastically yes. And to others that either haven't got their act together, or perhaps they don't want to, perhaps they're content with the present arrangements. You don't force them into it, but you say, if ever you do, and you get to a compelling proposition, we're all ears. And that's how I would propose it. But I accept that it comes with the price of administrative difference, and that can look messy, but Britain is messy.
Quite right. Well said. Well said. Arianna, I'm interested in, again, your reflections on that round, but also, from a policy agenda and policy progress perspective, does the kind of diversity of views, diversity of approaches, diversity of opinions, does that then slow progress? And I suppose, does it mean that chop and change, or change of perspective is an inevitable outcome of that? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to all the other contributors for very interesting comments. Since we are in an environment of kind of amicable disagreement, I have to say that I strongly disagree, but that's open for discussion, with the idea that devolution means necessarily local government reorganization. I think that they are two different things, and I think that we need to look at the state of local government, in particular in England, also as it compares to other similar countries. The size of local government in England is already one of the largest across Europe. According to the Self-Rule Index, the UK ranks 31st out of 39 countries in terms of local autonomy, and the average size of our councils is already kind of basically the largest across Western Europe. What is the problem with that? The problem is that if you make authority becoming even bigger than that, you continue to take the local out of local government. And so that's, you know, by definition, that is something that is not going to work. And that's why I perhaps agree more with the approach suggested by the report, that you need some kind of meso levels that work in an effective way without necessarily, you know, working on the size of local government as if that was the solution to get devolution right. I think if we look at examples from across Europe in particular, one way of getting devolution right is to get right the distribution of power across different tiers of government. Local government in England is already very much disempowered, is too big to be local. I fear that if you assume that devolution requires necessarily making local government even bigger, then there will be nothing left of the local. And that links again to the problem of the identity of people, how people feel attached to the place where they belong. If policy has to be place sensitive, then we have to recognize that the small scale matters as well. That's the first level where people feel that people feel belonging to and attachment to. So that's my criticism on that point.
Arianna, just on that point, which is a great point. Can I get your, so that's the emptying of the bottles outside of my office. It's not my house emptying the bottles from our drinking the night before. It's just in case anybody's getting excited, you know. Anyway, Arianna, I was just interested so are you saying that local authorities as currently organised are too big to be local, but does that mean that they're too small to be strategic?
Well, but that's why I'm saying that you need to get right the multi-level governance dimension. There are things that can be delivered well by local authority working on a small scale. There are others that need a greater scale to be delivered. Think of I don't know, transport, for example. The example of what has been happening in the north of England. Think of the idea of a body like Transport for the North that actually works at a pan-northern level, but then needs to work together and in collaboration with LEPs, combined authorities and councils. So that's my point there. Certainly local government alone cannot deliver everything, but there are very important things that can be delivered only by local government. And if you take that away from local government, then I suspect that feeling, especially, that could have an impact also on the way in which people perceive politics. If the message that we got over the recent years is that people feel that politics is done from places that are too far away from them, well, if you take away local government and make it too big for it to make sense for local communities, there's a risk of further detachment and disenchantment with politics.
Okay, very good. Okay, we've got a little bit of time left, but as always, it's against us. I want to pick up on this question. We've had lots of questions on this issue, which is, in a sense, it's somewhat ironic, I suppose, that, you know, the final report comes from a council that has been abolished, right, which is a mistake. I mean, I think a categorical mistake, which not have been abolished, very short-sighted of the government, would be my observation. But it also is on a subject where the very future of the subject seems to be less clear than maybe it was 12 or certainly 24 months ago, and certainly less clear than, you know, when Greg was in the hot seat at Bayes. So I want to get your kind of reflections on, you know, the status of devolution, I suppose, in the levelling up agenda, and the status of an industrial strategy approach within the levelling up agenda, because they are related, but I think they are slightly different. Kate, do you want to kick us off on that? You know, in a sense, the irony of you talking about devolution at a time was like, well, what does, you know, we're not sure now whether the commitment is as strong as maybe it was, and what does that mean for the future, Kate?
Well, you picked up a very apt point, because to be honest, when we started doing this piece of work, my anxiety was that by the time we had finished it, we would already have had the devolution white paper, and it would look behind the times. That's as many of my forecasts has turned out to be spectacularly wrong. But the fact that the political eye has perhaps moved a bit away from devolution as an important part of levelling up is a good reason for producing this, to draw people's attention back to the fact that really good, well-founded devolution is a very significant part of the attempt to level up places. I think this discussion has been really rich. I particularly agree with Arianna, by the way, about the fact that making local authorities too big would take away identity, and with some of the points that Greg has made that about Teesside. I used to be entertained when I was at the bank. I don't know if you found this, Andy, that if you went to Edinburgh, people didn't really like the fact that interest rates were set by the Bank of England. If you went to the Orkneys, however, they were just really pleased it wasn't done in Edinburgh. So, everywhere has their localities, and you can't satisfy all these identities. And identities need to be sort of thought about and defined. And the answer to this has to be the points to be made about collaboration. I mean, some of the you told a very strong story about the Northeast LEPs, Greg, and I absolutely recognise that. I look at the Kent-Essex LEP in which I live. Do I have an identity with the Kent-Essex LEP? No, not remotely. So it's not easy. I suppose I'm just saying it's not easy getting places right that really tell to identities, and sometimes they don't at first. I'm not sure, by the way, that the Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority initially really told to the area, but actually it now I think it does. The linkages are clearer, and the checks and balances within that area are clearer. But that's because of the power of the mayor, and whether we can replicate that in other areas based on reasonably functional geographies is not easy. But within that, we still have the local authorities in that area, and they will still be doing some of the local stuff. So I think that's why the word multi-scalar is important, actually.
Yeah, no, good. Paul, your kind of reflections on, in a sense of the appetite for and the centrality of devolution in the levelling up agenda, and what that might mean going forward.
Well, it definitely seems to have changed, doesn't it, over the last sort of 12 to 15 months. I think before the pandemic hit, it felt as if there was a great deal of fervour for it. And indeed, I think that was in some of the literature in terms of the manifestos. Interestingly, I think it does actually still talk about devolution in the more recent plan for growth, but definitely feels as if the mood music has changed. And we, as you were saying, Kate, we were hoping the devolution white paper was going to come out last summer, and we had inklings in it that were things that were not dissimilar to the types of things we've spoken about today. And it seems as if actually now we've moved very much away from that. I think that's a real shame in terms of for the government, in terms of trying to achieve its levelling up agenda, because a number of the things that it's talking about, a number of the things that it wants to see delivered will be best delivered with powers passed down to a more local level, where those powers best match the geography that they operate over. And I think the government won't be able to level up without empowering local government, giving them the powers that they need over, say, skills and transport in particular, and control over certain types of budgets, and then about how those things mesh together. Without doing that, I don't think we are going to tackle some of the fundamental challenges that a number of places face. And if those places don't tackle those challenges, then we're not going to level up, and we're not going to increase the size of the UK economy. So I hope that the government recognises that. I hope that in terms of the spats that they had with some of the mayors towards the end of last year, realised that actually that's because they're sort of caught in a bit of a weird place where they've created institutions, but they haven't really empowered them. So the mayors can have a puppet national government without necessarily the recourse back. Empower them. Give them the powers that they need, so the government can then turn around and say, hang on, why are you throwing stones at us when you haven't done X, Y, and Z? Or maybe they have done X, Y, and Z, then the government has just held the account full stop. But it's a case of we started on this journey, and Greg and colleagues sort of started to push us down this journey. Devolution very much is a journey, and I hope that it's not the case that we're at the end of the line now. I hope they are actually going to lay some more track down, and we do continue further down that line.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Arianna, your sort of reflections on the linkages between devolution, levelling up, and then obviously the degree to which industrial strategy type thinking and approach is still there, still evident?
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I fully agree with what Paul just said. You cannot have leveling up without a proper process of devolution. I think that's the big opportunity that the government has, because this is a government that has done more on devolution than what we've seen for quite a while, creating the metro mayors. There are now institutions that are taking root in local communities. There is a lot of evidence there that suggests that more devolution is the way forward. And again, going back to the point that the report makes, you cannot address regional inequalities if you don't decentralize. So there is a big opportunity there. If we look at the situation now, perhaps what worries me a little bit is the fact that the devolution white paper is now going to be kind of included into the leveling up white paper. What does that mean in practice? We will know it only when we see it, of course, but my worry there is that perhaps devolution becomes a subheadings within the leveling up agenda. And again, if we look at some of the things that have been done, especially in terms of funding as part of the leveling up agenda, the fact that a lot of the funding is actually managed by the center seems to suggest that there is a bit of an instinct of re-centralization. The pandemic will certainly have had an effect on this. There are a lot of factors to take into consideration, but there seems to be like some kind of hints there that perhaps devolution might not be central to the leveling up agenda, and it might be a kind of a desire of managing from the center leveling up. And I suspect that that would be a big missed opportunity if that was going to happen. But like I said, we haven't seen the white paper, so
yeah, we have to wait and see to a degree. But I think your sense of it, I think, is absolutely right. Greg, if I can come to you in the sense that your sort of views on where devolution sits now within the leveling up agenda, and I suppose where does devolution sit in the changing sort of political geography that we see now across the country? Because I think that is a subtext to many of these sort of things, and your advice as a kind of former advisor, insider on how we can push from the outside some of these issues would be greatly welcome. Then I get Andy to give his kind of final reflections. But Greg, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a fascinating time for this, and I think we've got to be open to some of the changes that are going on that should cause us to change our perspective. And I'll say something about that in a second. But just in terms of industrial strategy in this, so I've said at the beginning, actually, I think the components of the industrial strategy, 5 pillars: ideas, science, R&D, that's there, more prominent than ever, probably, certainly better funded. Skills, we're going to hear a lot about that during the year ahead and years ahead. Place was the chapter in the industrial strategy. It wasn't devolution, it was place. And place leveling up, clearly there's a kind of mapping there, which I'll come on to say something more about. Infrastructure, again, you see that very visibly in the government's programme, and a competitive business environment, although interestingly, as the industrial strategy started, giving license to perhaps a more, I hesitate to use the word interventionist because I don't think that's the wrong word, it's probably more of a kind of partnership, more of a co-working approach rather than a strict laissez-faire approach. So these components of the industrial strategy, the pillars of the industrial strategy, are there. That said, I think it is regrettable that there isn't something called the industrial strategy for a few reasons. One is that it's a plan for the future pulled together in a strategy. Strategy is a plan for the future that allows it to be evaluated. And the Industrial Strategy Council was set up to evaluate that progress. And I think the abolition of the council and the abolition of a strategy, even though the components are there, means that it's going to be more difficult to evaluate progress, and I think that is a bad thing. The other sense of what a strategy is, not just as in a forward plan, but it's an exercise in integration. It's bringing things together, bringing the different strands together. And I don't think the problem of different government departments and different silos operating in sometimes either deliberately or accidentally incompatible ways has been solved. And industrial strategy was an attempt to try to bring a greater coherence and get them at least pointing in the same direction. And I think, so there is a loss in that. But just on the specific point you raised, Andrew, about devolution and levelling up. So levelling up is not devolution. And actually place in the industrial strategy was place. It wasn't devolution. It was an interest, a focus on place. And your centre is the centre for cities. It's not the centre for devolution. So I don't think these terms are synonymous, but in trying to advance place and to give it a greater prominence, devolution or decentralisation, as I've usually preferred to call it, is something that I think has been helpful. But I think there is something very important that is going on at the moment and has done over the last few years that perhaps I have not quite appreciated so much when we put the industrial strategy together, which is that people in different places, especially those places that want to be levelled up, to use the expression, quite apart from local powers, there is a very strong view that they want to be part of the government of the United Kingdom. They feel, and I've experienced this talking to people on doorsteps across the country, and I think the last general election was a big reflection of this, that it's not just about, or even mostly about, devolving powers to our local institutions, that we want to be part of the national conversation. And certainly all of these Conservative MPs, or the vast majority of these Conservative MPs that have been returned from what used to be called red wall seats, I discern there, both in terms of their demeanour, but also the electorate that has propelled them there. It's, you go down to London and we want you to be part of this administration. And I think Boris Johnson, who is very skilled in intuiting moods and zeitgeists, very much reflects that. And his appeal, seen again in Hartlepool, is saying this is your government. You know, Hartlepool, you are part of the government. And that is a dimension that I think hasn't been so much part of this place discussion in the past, and is quite an exciting and I think radical new perspective.
Fantastic, a fascinating insight there that warrants further conversation and explanation, but not today. But we might get you back, if you don't mind, Greg, to explore that further, which I think perfectly encapsulates the local and the national and how those two things interrelate to each other. Andy, your kind of final reflections, I suppose, on the question, but also just your general wrap-up reflections as we rapidly get towards Hoppus 4. So, Andy, kind of reflections on devolution and levelling up, and more general reflections from you.
That's a big question. The time is short, Andrew, so I'll try and be quick.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you to you and all of the panelists for what's been an absolutely brilliant discussion. I've certainly learned huge amounts, and I hope this is, I'm sure it will be, although the council is ending, this is a conversation I hope between us we can continue, because it is that important and there's still a lot still to get straight. The devolution white paper is 6 months away. Unfortunately, it's been 6 months away for the last 2.5 years. I do hope at some point that will be true, because I think it is going to be, for me, an essential ingredient for making good on the levelling up agenda, for all the reasons that people have said. And it is more a question, as again, as others have said, of how rather than whether, if we're going to make progress. Kate said at the beginning, it would be a process rather than an event, and that must be true. We would, I think, want a process that ultimately is seen as being fair, comprehensive, and consistent. I think if a process hasn't got those features, it will ultimately be rejected politically, and therefore not long-lived. And we're all agreeing we need a process that is long-lived, because that has not been our history, and has been one of the reasons why levelling up has not been made good on. So for me, that does speak, if not to a full-fat constitutional solution, then at least something that is definably a framework that can be flexed, but is nonetheless a consistent and comprehensive framework, and not a pick and mix. And on the last of those, the question of capability has been raised more than once, and the council actually did quite a lot of work on capability across different parts of the UK, and it's a very, very patchy pattern. And I worry that, right now it's clear that capability, or the differences in capability across different parts and across different regions, that is part of the problem. And if something is part of the problem, it cannot then be part of the solution to that problem. In other words, I do think as an essential ingredient of levelling up, there does need to be a degree of capacity and capability building in all parts of the UK, endowing them with that holy trinity of people, powers and monies I mentioned earlier on, helping build the anchor institutions that can make decisions and can strike good deals. I think without that building of capacity and capability, I fear those that can will, and those that can't will be left further behind. And that, of course, is the complete antithesis of levelling up. Thank you, Andrew. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Another great issue and topic that we'll come back to for certain, get you to come back and explore that in much more detail. It's slightly over 4:30. Let me apologize for that, but I think hopefully like me, you've all found it an incredibly rich conversation with lots of insights and perspectives, some agreement, some disagreement, which is always adds to the spice of the conversation. My thanks to panelists and speakers, Andy, Kate, Arianna, Paul, and Greg, for your brilliant contributions. Very, very much appreciated. WM Ready were obviously part of the authors of the report and helped us with the event. So thank you very much to them. Thank you for putting all your questions in. I tried to sort of distill the essence of them, even if I didn't express them quite the way that you would have wanted me to. But thank you very much for your questions. As I said, a copy of or recording of the event, the slides that Kate used, and then links to the final report of the council, you'll all be able to get them on the Centre for Cities website, pretty sharpish, centreforcities.org. And with that, until the next time, thanks very much. Stay safe and take care. Bye for now.